Right, so today we are starting our discussion of the endocrine system. If you remember back when we discussed chapter 1, we stated that we have two different organ systems that will act as control centers. And the first organ system that acts as a control center, this was my central nervous system, or generally speaking, the nervous system. And the other organ system that acted as a control center was the endocrine system. If you remember, the difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system, nervous system was acting by sending out electrical impulses in the form of action potential along the length of the axons or the nerve fibers. Compared to the endocrine system, it was formed of glands that would be responsible to release their chemical messages that we've called the hormones outside directly in the bloodstream for them to reach their target organs. If you remember, we stated that the nervous system is much more specific because it's targeting specific organs. So this electrical message is going to be reaching one specific muscle at a time or one specific gland at a time. Compared to the endocrine system is much less specific. Why is it less specific? Because simply this blood is going to be traveling everywhere. So the hormones that I'm releasing from those glands going to be reaching almost everywhere in the body because every single organ is going to be supplied by the blood. So those hormones are going to be distributed across the body and will be reaching all the different organs. But the specificity here of those hormones is going to be determined according to whether the organ has a receptor for this specific hormone or not. So some hormones will be acting almost on every single organ, like the growth hormone, for example, like the insulin. Those hormones are going to be acting on most of the organs, as most of the organs have the receptors for those hormones. So the specificity here of the endocrine system or the specific hormone is going to be determined according to whether the organ has a receptor or not for this specific hormone. If you remember, also a major difference that we've stated between the nervous system and the endocrine system is that the nervous system is much faster compared to the endocrine system. It's going to be much slower in affecting the different organs compared to the nervous system. In some cases, it's going to be so fast, but still compared to the nervous system, it's going to be slower. But a major function also between the nervous system and the endocrine system was that the nervous system is going to be acting by short-acting messages. So the effect of the electrical signal on the specific muscle is going to be lasting for a much shorter period of time if I compare it to the effect of the hormones on those organs. They are going to be providing you with a more prolonged action. So nervous system is more specific, it's faster, but it's short acting. It has a very short duration of action. Compared to the hormones or the endocrine system, it's going to be much less specific, slower, and on the other hand, it's going to have a more prolonged duration of action. The hormones are long-distance chemical signals that will be traveling through the blood and blood. I might be acting on myself as a gland. We call those glands are autocrine glands. Auto means self. Those chemicals exert effect on the same cells that they secrete them. So I will have a cell. The cell releases its hormone for it to affect itself. Like for example, in case of repair of a blood vessel, for example, the endothelial cells, the epithelium lining those blood vessels, are going to be releasing a growth factor. The epithelial or endothelial derived growth factor, and the endothelial derived growth factor is going to be stimulating the endothelial cells for them to proliferate and cover the injured site. So here I'm acting on myself. So the cells that are releasing the hormone is going to be or are going to be the ones that will also be affected by this hormone. Paracrine means I'm affecting other cells. Paracrine, those are locally acting chemicals that affect cells other than those that will be secreting them. So for example, the stomach will be releasing a special hormone called the gastrin. Endothelial cells are going to be releasing a hormone called the gastrin. It acts locally on the stomach for the stomach to increase the rate of its motility and to enhance its glandular secretions. So gastrin here is locally released. It acts locally but on a different type of cells that got them secreted. We classify the hormones according to their chemical structure into two main classes. Either they are amino acid based hormones, those are either polypeptide chains, they are chains of amino acids, or they are more complex, they are large proteins. Those are like the amines, the thyroxine, the peptides, and proteins. The second class of hormones, according to the chemical structure, those are the steroids, and steroids are going to be formed from the cholesterol. So they are lipid based. They are fat, they're going to be fat soluble. Those are like the gonadal and the adrenocortical hormones. Like the sex hormones, those are steroids. The adrenocortical hormones, those are also steroid in nature, or they are cholesterol-based hormones. How would I be acting as a hormone to affect a specific cell? So starting first with those hormones that have an amino acid-based structure. So if we look at here, the hormone is acting as a message. And as you see, this hormone, in order for it to act on the cell needs a receptor for it to be able to respond to this hormone. So the very first thing for a hormone to do in order to act on a specific cell is to find and to bind to its specific receptor on the surface of the cell. So we call the hormone on here, it's the first messenger. Attached to this receptor on the internal surface of the plasma membrane, we've got a protein that becomes activated once you bind the hormone to the receptor. We call this protein, it's the G protein. G protein gets activated by gaining GTP, and it's a form of energy like the ATP. ATP is the adenine triphosphate here. This is a guanine triphosphate. And in order for it to be activated, it needs to release a low energy molecule, GDP, diphosphate, and to bind to a high energy molecule. This is going to be the GTP. Once it binds to the GTP, it's going to be dissociated from the receptor, and it will be traveling to activate another protein. This is the adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase function is to transform and break down an ATP, an adenosine triphosphate, not into ADP, but into cyclic AMP. So I've got adenosine triphosphate. I'm formed of adenine attached to me, 3 phosphate groups like this. So what the adenylate cyclase is going to be doing, adenylate cyclase is going to be breaking down 2 phosphate groups from the ATP and transform it into an adenosine monophosphate. It has a single phosphate group attached to the adenine, like what you see on here. This cyclic AMP, it's going to be responsible to activate protein kinases. And the protein kinases, those are enzymes that will be adding a phosphate to other enzymes for them to become either activated or deactivated. So what carries the message to the inside of the cell? Actually, it's the cyclic AMP. And the cyclic AMP here is what we're going to call the second messenger. Why do we call it the second messenger? Because it's simply going to be carrying the signal from being close to the cell membrane for it to be conducted to the inside of the cell to affect the actual enzymes that will be active. So for example, an amino acid based hormone is called glucagon, and the glucagon is going to be responsible to increase the blood sugar level, as we're going to see later today in this session. So if I'm following the action of the glucagon, glucagon will first bind to the resurface receptor, the plasma membrane receptor. It cannot travel directly to the inside of the cell because I'm an amino acid based. And the cell membrane is formed by phospholipid bilayer. So I'm not lipid soluble for me to be able to pass through the phospholipid bilayer. So I need to bind to a surface receptor, as you see on here. Once I bind to the surface receptor, again, what's going to happen? The surface receptor is going to be attached to a protein called the G protein. Once the glucagon binds to its receptor, the G protein will be able to become activated, and it gets activated by binding to a GTP. Now I've got G protein that has been activated, and it's attached to a GTP. This activated G protein is going to be acting on another surface protein called the adenylate cyclase. And the adenylate cyclase function is to transform an ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is going to be activating the inactive protein kinases into their active forms. And those protein kinases are going to be activating the enzymes responsible to carry on the action of the glucagon. So glucagon is going to be acting on the liver cells. So here I'm acting on the liver cells as glucagon. So what I'm looking at is the liver cell. And as an example here, what action would I have? I am enhancing the breakdown, let's say, of the stored form of the glucose, which is the glycogen. I'm breaking down the glycogen into glucose. So the activated protein kinases on here will be activating by adding phosphate group to the enzyme that is responsible to break down the glycogen into glucose. So now I have conducted the action of the glucagon. So glucagon again is an amino acid base, as an example on here. It can't travel through the phospholipid bilayer. Again, why? Because I am an amino acid based hormone. I can't pass through the phospholipid bilayer as I'm not lipid soluble. So I need to bind to a surface receptor. Once I bind to the surface receptor, this will activate a G protein. The G protein gets activated by binding to a high energy molecule called GTP. G protein, once activated, is going to be activating adenylate cyclase for it to transform an ATP to a cyclic AMP. And remember, cyclic AMP here, we've given it a nickname. We called it the second messenger. This is the one that carries on the action of the hormone inside the cell. Because the first messenger was the hormone itself. Cyclic AMP activates protein kinases that will then either activate or deactivate specific enzymes. In this example of the glucagon, it will be activating the enzymes responsible to break down the glycogen, the stored form of glucose, into glucose for it to increase the blood glucose levels. All right, this is the specific action here of the glucagon as an example. All right, so how about the steroid hormones? Steroid hormones are cholesterol based. They are lipid soluble, so they can pass through the phospholipid bilayer. I can travel from outside in without any problem. But in order for me to have an action on the cell, this hormone needs to bind to an intracellular receptor. It's a receptor protein. Without it, this hormone will not have an action on the target cell. So I've got a steroid hormone is capable to travel to the inside of the cell, passing through the phospholipid bilayer, no problems because I am lipid soluble. And then inside the cytoplasm of the target cell, it's going to be binding to an intracellular receptor. This intracellular receptor, when attached to the hormone, is going to be forming a receptor hormone complex. The receptor hormone complex is the active form that is actually going to be carrying on the action inside the cell. This receptor hormone complex is going to be traveling to the inside of the nucleus, passing through the nuclear pores, and it's going to be targeting specific regions on the target cell, on the target cell's DNA. It will be turning on specific DNA sequences, specific genes. And those genes, when turned on, they will be expressed. So how do we express specific gene? If you remember, you form first a copy of this specific gene that you want to translate. We call this is a transcription. I form a messenger RNA, and then this messenger RNA, if you remember, gonna be traveling to the outside of the nucleus in the cytoplasm or the rough endoplasmic reticulum. This is where it's gonna meet with the different ribosomes that are going to be responsible to read the sequence on the message and to start to code the specific amino acids that you've got the codes of on your DNA. And this is going to result in the formation of your new protein. Example on here, like for example, the testosterone or the male androgens. So what is the effect? Something that is widely known. What is the effect of the androgens, the male sex hormones, on the muscle size? You will hear people talking about taking steroids to do what to the muscles? To enhance muscle growth, right? So you'll see people taking injections of testosterone, trying to boost their testosterone levels in order for them to gain muscle bulk. So how the testosterone or the androgen gonna have an effect on my muscle cells, increasing the muscle bulk. Steroid hormones are lipid soluble, so the testosterone is going to be simply traveling to the inside of the muscle cells. It's going to be binding to an intracellular receptor, as you see on here. And as you form a hormone receptor complex, this hormone receptor complex is going to be passing to the inside of the nucleus, turning on specific genes, coding for the formation of the myosin, coding for the formation of the actin. So as a result of the activation of those specific genes or those specific DNA sequences, I will be forming the myosin filaments, the thick filaments. I will be building up the actin filaments, thin filaments. So I have more contractile myofilaments now than before because the androgen did enhance the cell to form those proteins that will end up forming my contractile myofilaments. So what happens to the size of the muscle as you increase the number of the myofilaments inside the muscle cells, the muscle size is going to be increasing. All right, so again, what is the difference between an amino acid-based hormone and the steroid-based hormone? The main difference is going to be determined by their chemical structure. Remember, amino acid-based hormones are not lipid soluble, so they will need to bind to a surface receptor. Compared to the steroid-based hormones, they are lipid soluble, so they can pass to the inside of the cell, passing through the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane, but in the same time, they will still need to have a receptor to act on the cell. But those receptors that they will be binding to, they are intracellular receptors. They are not surface receptors. They are not integrated within the plasma membrane. They are going to be kept inside the cytoplasm. Questions? Questions? All right, so what actually going to be triggering the glands to release their hormones? What stimulates the gland? So according to what the gland going to be determining whether it should release more of its hormone or not. We've got three different stimuli that might trigger the activation of the glands and the hormone release from those glands. First one, it's a chemical change within the blood. So change in the chemical composition of the blood. We call this as a humoral stimulus. A humoral stimulus means I've got a variation in the chemical composition of the blood. Neural stimulus, I am responding to the nervous system. So in some cases, as we're going to see, the nervous system is going to be actually sending out signals to specific endocrine glands for them to respond by releasing their hormones. Another type of stimulation to the endocrine glands is going to be a hormonal stimulus. And the hormonal stimulus, in this case, the glands are responding to a hormone coming from another gland. Please make sure you can see the difference here between the humoral stimulus and the hormonal stimulus. Don't mix them up. Humoral means they are related to blood. But hormonal means I'm responding to a specific hormone that gets released from a different endocrine gland. So examples on here include for the humoral response, like in case of gland called the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid gland is going to be releasing a hormone called the parathyroid hormone, or PTH. And PTH function is to increase the blood calcium level. So what actually going to be triggering the four tiny little glands located on the dorsal surface of the thyroid gland, which are my parathyroid glands? To release the PTH. What actually triggers the release of the PTH is going to be the blood chemical composition. Whenever those glands detect a decline in the blood calcium levels, whenever I have a drop in the blood calcium level, those glands gonna be responding by releasing PTH. And the PTH action is gonna be to increase the blood calcium level back to normal. And we're gonna see how PTH is gonna be conducting its action later today. Example here of the neural control. It's the gland located above the kidney. We call this the adrenal gland or the suprarenal gland. And we're going to learn that the suprarenal gland has two different parts, an internal part and an external part. The internal part of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla, and the external part of the adrenal gland is going to be the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla gets activated by the sympathetic nervous system. If you remember, sympathetic is going to be activated in case of fight or flight, remember? In case of stress, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your blood sugar goes up. All those going to be mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. So actually, the adrenal gland is going to be releasing hormones that will boost the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. Those are called my epinephrine or the adrenaline and noradrenaline and norepinephrine. And why do I release those hormones? To boost the sympathetic nervous system activity. So what actually stimulates those glands to release their specific hormones? It's the sympathetic nervous system. And so this is going to be a neural control. I've got the nervous system directly activating the gland for it to release its hormone in response. A third type of stimulation of the adrenal of the endocrine glands, it's going to be the hormonal stimulation. And again, here I'm not responding to the nervous system. I'm not responding to the chemical change in the blood. I'm responding to another hormone that got released from a different endocrine gland. So, for example, the gonads, the testis as an example, it's going to be releasing the male sex hormones in response to another hormone that gets released from gland called the pituitary gland. Same for the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex is going to be releasing its hormones in response to another hormone that gets released from the pituitary gland. Thyroid gland going to be releasing its hormone in response to another hormone that gets released from the pituitary gland. So you see on here, I've got hormones that are stimulating the glands to release their own hormones. All right, so it's what we call the hormonal stimulation. Hormonal stimulation. So what are the different glands that will be participating in the formation of the endocrine system? We've got the pineal gland. Do you remember we discussed the pineal gland back in the CNS? Do you remember what was the function of the pineal gland and what was it part of? What is the function of the pineal gland and what is it part of? Anybody remembers? Do you remember what are the four main parts of the brain? You remember what are the four main parts of the brain? Cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and the cerebellum. If you remember, the diencephalon was formed by three parts. Those are thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. And remember, the epithalamus was formed of two main parts. Those are the choroid plexus and the pineal gland. And the pineal gland, if you remember, this was responsible to release the melatonin to regulate the sleep-wake cycles. That's exactly, Theodore. Thank you so much. So again, pineal gland is part of the epithalamus, and it was releasing the melatonin to regulate the sleep-wake cycles, the different rhythmic patterns that we follow. Hypothalamus is also going to be participating in the regulation of the endocrine system. It's going to be releasing hormones that will be released from the pituitary gland, to be more specific, the posterior pituitary gland. Then we've got the pituitary gland that is pending down here from the hypothalamus, pending down from the brain. Do you remember what is the pouch in the skull that holds the pituitary gland? Do you remember back from our discussion of the skeletal system? What did we call this socket where I keep the pituitary gland pending down from the base of the brain? Do you remember the name of the socket where the pituitary gland is kept inside the skull? Anybody? Cella. Do you remember something like this? Cella turcica. If you remember, the spheroid bone that has this socket-like structure that keeps the pituitary gland, and this is what we call the cella turcica. Another gland that you can see on here, it's going to be located in the lower aspect of the anterior part of the neck in front of the trachea. Normally, it shouldn't be palpable. Normally, the thyroid gland, it's not palpable, so you can't feel it. You can't feel it. On the dorsal surface of the thyroid gland, we've got four tiny little glands that are kept very close to the thyroid glands. They are my parathyroid glands. Para means close to or next to. So those are the glands close to the thyroid. They are parathyroid glands. In the anterior compartment of the chest cavity, we've got the thymus. Thymus is so prominent, so large in children, and then as a person gets older, it starts to vanish and shrinks. This is where a very important type of immune cells gets activated. It's called the T lymphocytes. If we have to move in down, those pyramidal shaped glands located above the kidney, those are adrenal glands. Ad on top, renal, kidney. Another name for the adrenal gland is suprarenal gland. Suprarenal, supra above renal, kidney. So those two pyramidal shaped glands, those are my adrenal glands or suprarenal glands. In the abdomen, we can see another gland on here. This is the pancreas. And then down in the pelvis, in females, we've got the ovary, which is the female gonad, and in males, bending down from the pelvic cavity in the scrotum, we've got the male primary sex organ. This is going to be the testes. So ovaries and testes are going to be also releasing chemical messages through the bloodstream. So we consider them as endocrine glands. So again, those are the different glands that we're going to be discussing in this chapter. We started first with the pineal gland, that is part of the epithalamus, then the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, thyroid gland, and those four tiny glands on the dorsal surface of the thyroid. Those are my parathyroid glands. Down in the chest, we've got the thymus. Above the kidneys, those are my adrenal glands. The abdomen, we've got the pancreas. And down in the pelvis, we've got the ovaries and the testes. Here, those are the gonads. Starting first with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is not a single gland, it's actually two separate glands. The pituitary gland, as you see on here, it's going to be pending down from the hypothalamus. It has an anterior part and a posterior part. We call this anterior part, it's the anterior pituitary gland, or the adenohypophysis. And the posterior one, it's going to be the posterior pituitary gland, or another name for it, it's the neurohypophysis. Why do I call this one adenohypophysis and this one neurohypophysis? Because simply adeno, if you remember, adeno, it's a gland. So I am formed actually of glandular tissue, epithelial cells. And those epithelial cells are going to be releasing their own hormones directly in the bloodstream. Yes, they are controlled by the nerve cells coming down from the hypothalamus. They are under the control of the hypothalamus. But the gland itself, it's full of glandular cells, epithelial cells, that will be releasing their own hormones. That's why we call this gland. It's an adenohypophysis. It's formed of glandular tissue. Posterior pituitary gland, on the other hand, it's not going to contain any glandular tissue. Instead, it's going to be just a pouch that will store and regulate the release of the chemicals released from the nerve cells coming down from the hypothalamus. So I don't have glandular cells on here. What I have are the terminal ends of the nerve cells coming down from the hypothalamus. That's why we call the posterior pituitary gland the neurohypophysis. So again, pituitary gland has two different parts. The adenohypophysis, you see on here, I am formed of glandular tissue, epithelium, that is controlled by the nerve cells of the hypothalamus, but I am actually releasing my own hormones. Here in the neurohypophysis, you see on here the posterior pituitary gland. Posterior pituitary gland does not have its own glandular tissue. Instead, it's going to simply be acting as a pouch for the secretions of the nerve cells coming down from the hypothalamus. So again, two different parts of the pituitary gland. Anterior pituitary gland, it's my adrenal hypothesis. Posterior pituitary gland, it's the neuro hypothesis. Let's have a look at the different hormones that get released from the anterior pituitary gland. First hormones that we gonna have released from the anterior pituitary gland is gonna be the growth hormone. And from its name, what do you think is gonna be the function of the growth hormone? What do you think is the function of the growth hormone? From its name, it promotes growth. And it's going to be acting on all the different body organs, but it's targeting more the bones and skeletal muscles. It actually enhances the protein formation and encourages the cells to break down the fat as a source of energy. So growth hormone here, so simple, it's gonna be promoting the growth mainly of the bones and skeletal muscles. So if a person has deficiency in the growth hormone, if I don't have enough growth hormone as a child, if I don't have enough growth hormone, what would I develop? I would develop dwarfism. Dwarfism. What if I have hypersecretion of the growth hormone? What would I have in response to hypersecretion of the growth hormone as a child? What would I develop? I would develop gigantism. So in case of hypersecretion of growth hormone in children, they develop gigantism. In case of hyposecretion of the growth hormone in children, this results in dwarfism. What if I had hypersecretion as an adult? Can you get taller now? What do you think? Can you get taller now? No. Why? Do you remember why you can't get any taller now? No epiphyseal plates. Exactly. My long bones, they don't have any more remaining cartilage. Because remember, you can't form a bone from scratch. You need to increase the thickness of the cartilage and then replace the cartilage with bone. So as an adult, I don't have any more epiphyseal plates to allow the growth of my long bones so I can become taller. But what if I have, as an adult, hypersecretion of the growth hormone? Everything else is going to be growing except for my long bones. So my skull is going to be increasing in size as a flat bone. My mandible, my tongue, my nose, my ears, my hands, my feet, my heart. We call this as acromegaly. Acromegaly. But I won't be a giant. I can't become taller. Why again? Because I don't have any more epiphyseal plates, any remaining cartilage in my lung bones for me to get tall. All right. Moving on to another hormone that gets released from the anterior pituitary gland. This is a hormone that we call the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. What do you think is the action of a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone? What do you think? What do you think is the action of a hormone that's called thyroid stimulating hormone? It is the hormone that stimulates the thyroid to do what? To release its own hormones. So here the TSH is going to be needed for you to stimulate the thyroid gland, for the thyroid gland to release the thyroid hormones. How about another hormone on here called ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone? So what do you understand from the name here? What can you understand from the name? What's going to be the action here of ACTH? I am a hormone that do what? Tropic to stimulate. So I am the hormone that stimulates what? The adrenocortico, the cortex of the adrenal gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. So what I can understand here, I'm a hormone that stimulates tropic the adrenocortico. What I mean by adrenocortico, the cortex of the adrenal gland. Remember, we mentioned that the gland here, the adrenal gland, has an outer cortex and an inner medulla. So this hormone is targeting what? It's targeting the cortex. All right? Adrenocortico, cortex of the adrenal gland. All right, and we're gonna learn what hormones are gonna be released from the cortex after break today. All right, so again, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, it's the hormone that stimulates my outer part of the adrenal gland, or what we call the adrenal cortex. ACTH. Another hormone that will be released from the anterior pituitary gland, it's the set of hormones called the gonadotropins. The gonadotropins are going to be activating what? Tropin, remember from the previous hormone, tropic. Tropic means to stimulate. So what are those hormones stimulating? They are tropins. Tropins means they are stimulants to the gonads, gonadotropins. So I am stimulating the gonads. And what are the gonads? Can you remind me, please? What are the gonads? Those are the primary sex organs that will be responsible for the production of the gametes, or the sperms and eggs. So gonads, those in males, are the testes. And in females, those gonna be the ovaries. So the gonadotropins are stimulating the gonads to do what? To do their function. And what is the function of the gonads? What's the function of the gonads? So I have two main functions of the gonads. Why do you have testes? Why do you have ovaries? To do what with them? Two main things. What do you think? What are the two main functions of the gonads? Gamete formation, gamete production. So in the testes, the formation of sperms, and in the ovaries, the formation of the eggs. Another thing on here, production of estrogen, sex hormones. So here in females, we've got the estrogens, progesterone, and in males, we've got the testosterone or the androgens, male sex hormones. So as you told me here, the main functions of those gonads would be to produce the gametes, the sperms and eggs, and the other function of those gonads would be to produce the sex hormones, estrogen, females, androgens in males. So we've got two different hormones. This information is not highly accurate, but this is what we need to know for the sake of this class. So you're going to learn more details as you discuss the reproductive system. So the gonadotropins are going to be stimulating the gonads to do their functions, which is the production of sperms, eggs, and the formation of the sex hormones. So we've got two different hormones that got released from the anterior pituitary gland to stimulate the gonads to produce their main two functions. The first one, it's the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone. And this is the one that will be stimulating the gonads to form the gametes, eggs and sperms. And the other hormone that is getting released from the anterior pituitary gland as a gonadotropin, it's called the LH or the luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone, it's going to be stimulating the gonads to produce their own sex hormones, androgen in females and in males, and the estrogen in females. So again, what are the different hormones that get released from the anterior pituitary gland? We've got the growth hormone. It's affecting all the organs, more specifically the skeletal system, bones, and the skeletal muscles. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, it's going to be stimulating the thyroid gland to release its own hormone, to release the thyroid hormone. Anterior pituitary gland also is going to be producing ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. From its name, it stimulates the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland to release its hormones. And we're going to learn what hormones are going to be released after that. Gonadotropins, tropin means stimulating. I'm stimulating what? The gonads. So I'm stimulating the gonads to form two functions: formation of eggs and sperms, and production of sex hormones. FSH, LH. FSH for the production of sperms and eggs, LH for the release of the gonadal hormones. The follicles are the egg surrounded by other cells. The egg surrounded by other cells. Those are the follicles. All right. The ovulated egg, when it gets ovulated from the ovary, it's not in the ovary, it's not follicle anymore, it has been released from the follicle. When it gets ovulated, at this point, we're gonna need the cilia, the portion of the cilia of the simple columnar epithelium in the uterine tube to allow its movement towards the endometrium if it got fertilized in the uterine tube. All right. Another hormone that gets released from the anterior pituitary gland, it's the prolactin. Pro means before, and lactin means lactation. Lactation means the milk production. Prolactin is going to be responsible for the milk production. Its blood levels going to be rising towards the end of pregnancy. This is where I need the mammary glands to start the production and the formation of the milk for the lactation after labor. Suckling stimulates a hormone coming down from the hypothalamus called the prolactin releasing hormone to stimulate the adrenal gland to release the prolactin. So again, what is the function here of the prolactin? Is going to be to stimulate the mammary glands to produce the milk late during pregnancy. Moving on to the different hormones that will be released from the neurohypophysis or the posterior pituitary gland. So now we are looking at the different hormones released from the posterior pituitary gland or the neurohypophysis. So we got only two hormones that will be released from the neurohypophysis. Those are the oxytocin and the ADH, the anti-diuretic hormone. Let's start first with the oxytocin. Oxytocin has two main functions. We just discussed one of them back in chapter 1 as an example of a positive feedback. If you remember, during labor, what initially stimulates the labor to take place, remember, is the amount of stretch that is applied on the wall of the uterus by the baby. And if you remember, in response to this stretch applied by the baby on the wall of the uterus started to perform a contraction. And this contraction actually was detected by receptors that will send out signals to the hypothalamus And in response to those signals, the hypothalamus is going to be releasing through the posterior pituitary gland a hormone called oxytocin. And the oxytocin function was to stimulate the uterine contractions. And remember, as I get more uterine contractions under the effect of the oxytocin, more stimulation going to be taking place to the neurohypophysis and the hypothalamus for them to release more oxytocin, and more oxytocin will cause more contractions of the uterus, and the more contractions, the more stimulation of the hypothalamus will take place, and this results in more oxytocin secretion, causing more uterine contractions. Again, this is gonna keep going until labor has been complete, until the baby gets out of the uterus. Another function of the oxytocin is going to be to enhance the lactation by stimulating the milk ejection. So if we're looking here at a sagittal section of the breast, inside the breast we've got the lactiferous glands, the mammary glands, and the mammary glands will have those ducts on here. Those are the lactiferous ducts. And towards the end of the lactiferous ducts, we've got those spaces where the milk gonna be accumulated, ready to be released. Those are the lactiferous sinuses. What stimulates the ejection of the milk outside through the opening of the lactiferous duct in the nipple? It's the suckling of the baby to the nipple. So the nipple, when suckled, it sends out signals to the hypothalamus. And in response to those signals, the hypothalamus gonna be releasing oxytocin. And oxytocin here gonna stimulate those lactiferous sinuses to contract, to squeeze the milk to the outside, allowing what we call the milk ejection or milk letdown. So again, what we're looking at in here, looking at the action of the oxytocin. Oxytocin is the first of two hormones that will be released from the neurohypophysis or the posterior pituitary gland. The two main functions of the oxytocin will be to enhance the uterine contractions during childbirth and to allow the milk ejection. So which hormone is necessary for milk production? What hormone is necessary for milk production? Anybody? Prolactin. Remember, production of the milk is carried by the prolactin. What is the hormone that is responsible for the milk ejection to the outside? Milk letdown, ejection. What is the hormone? Oxytocin. So in order for me to have a normal lactation, females will need to have normal production of prolactin, normal production of oxytocin. Other function of the oxytocin also is going to be responsible for sexual arousal and orgasm in both males and females. If you remember, hypothalamus is part of the limbic system, so it plays a role in the production of emotions. So again, where is the ADH and the oxytocin are coming from? Again, here you see they are released from the terminal ends of the nerve cells. So if you remember, a nerve cell, neuron, has a secretory region, which is in the terminal ends. We've got the terminal boutons or lobes, and those are going to be releasing the neurotransmitters. So here I'm releasing them as neurotransmitters, right? But those can't be called neurotransmitters simply because they are not going to be affecting a postsynaptic nerve cell or an effective organ through a synapse. Rather than binding to the receptor on the target organs, they will be actually released out in the circulation, in the blood. So they are not going to be considered as neurotransmitters. They are going to be considered as hormones because they get released out in the bloodstream. You see the difference? So those are the same as the acetylcholine that got released from the nerve cell. Same concept. They get released from the terminal end of the neurons, but we call them hormones on here because simply they get released out in the bloodstream, not as neurotransmitters in a specific uh, location limited to a synapse. Hormones acting as a neurotransmitter, you can't consider them neurotransmitters. You can't consider them neurotransmitters. They are hormones because simply they are traveling through the blood. This is the definition of a hormone. All right. The neurotransmitter is going to be limited to a specific synapse. So whatever you're going to be releasing from a nerve cell to act on another nerve cell or to act on an effective organ in a specific synapse, this is going to be considered a neurotransmitter. And we we've mentioned many examples of the neurotransmitters: acetylcholine, norepinephrine, the uh, the catecholamines, the amines, even ATP, nitric oxide. All those are examples of neurotransmitters. We categorize them as neurotransmitters because simply they are acting as a signal between two nerve cells or between a nerve cell and the target organ in a specific location. They are not going to be traveling outside in the bloodstream. So we're going to even see some neurotransmitters here. They are widely known as neurotransmitters like the norepinephrine. Once it's released out in the bloodstream, it's going to be called the hormone, not a neurotransmitter anymore. So the definition of a neurotransmitter is that it acts between the two nerve cells or a nerve cell and the target cell. But a definition of a hormone, it's a signal, the same, it might be the same exact chemical message, but we will not be considered anymore as a neurotransmitter. We're going to consider it a hormone because it is simply traveling in the bloodstream. All right, does this make sense? All right, so looking at another hormone that gets released from the posterior pituitary gland, and it's what we call the anti-diuretic hormone, or ADH. Another name for the anti-diuretic hormone, it's vasopressin. So those two names of the hormone are going to tell you everything that you need to know about this hormone. So let's start with the first name, ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. I am a hormone that is doing what? I'm anti-diuretic. What anti means? Anti means I'm preventing. And diuresis, what's diuresis? Did you hear about medications called diuretics? The water pill. You know what is diuretic? Diuretic means? Any idea what's a diuretic? Yeah, it increases, makes you urinate. It means it increases the water output in the urine. So I increase the amount of urine output by adding water to it. So what's diuresis? Diuresis is the water loss in the urine. So where do you get the urine from? Did you ask yourself, where is this urine coming from? Where is this water coming from? Where was it located before it gets released out in the urine? It was in the blood, right? So if this is my blood in here, and this will be the kidney tubules that will form the urine. And what I'm doing is I'm filtering the blood into the kidney tubules, and the waste as well as some of the water will be moving from the blood into the kidney tubules and then will become the urine. So ADH is doing what? It's preventing the water loss in the urine. So what's going to be the effects of ADH on the urine output? Would I have more or less urine output? Would I have an increase or decrease in the amount of urine? Decrease in the urine output. And what's going to happen to the concentration of the urine? What do you think? If you are preventing water from being released out in the urine, if I'm preventing just water, will it become more or less concentrated? So try to imagine you have a cup of coffee and you kept boiling the coffee. Boiling the coffee means you're losing water, losing water. So here I'm losing water. What's going to happen to the concentration of the coffee if you kept boiling this coffee over and over? It becomes more and more concentrated. So this is the same exact concept. So I have a decrease in the urine output, but in the same time, as I'm reducing the amount of water out in the urine, so the urine concentration is going to go up. So what's going to be the effect here on my blood? If I'm not losing water out in the urine, you know, any penny not spent is saved or gained, right? Any penny not spent is gained. So if I'm not losing water out, what's going to happen to this water is going to be kept in my blood. And if it's kept in the blood, what's going to happen to my blood volume? Will increase the blood volume as I'm not losing the water out, so I didn't lose it, I gained it. If I didn't lose it, I've gained it as part of my blood. So This is going to result in an increase in the blood volume. And what's going to happen if you have an increase in the blood volume to your blood pressure? So I can imagine you have two cans, one that has 1 liter of water and the other one has 10 liters of water, and you put them on the table. Which one applies more pressure, the 10 liters or the 1 liter? So the greater the volume, the higher its pressure, right? So if I'm increasing the blood volume because I've prevented the water loss out in the urine, I retain the water in my blood. So the blood volume gonna increase, and as I increase my blood volume, what's gonna happen to my blood pressure? My blood pressure goes up. I have an increase in the blood pressure. So again, ADH is gonna be preventing the water loss in the urine. It retains water. And ADH is gonna be released when? If you have more water than what you need or less water than what you need. If the water intake is low or is high. What do you think? If I'm not drinking all day long, would I have high ADH or low ADH? If I'm not drinking any water, ADH will be released to keep the blood. You don't care about the urine volume, you care about your blood volume, right? So what you're gonna do, the ADH is gonna be preventing the drop in your blood volume by retaining the water from being released out in the urine. Yes, there is a mandatory water loss in the urine, which is 500 milliliters per day. But you're gonna be trying to retain as much as you can because you don't have enough water intake from outside. So you retain it to maintain a normal blood volume. All right. Another function of ADH, we can see it from the name on here, vasopressin, vaso, blood vessel. Pressin means applying pressure. So try to imagine here, I have a water hose, and this is my yard on here. And the water is only reaching this part of the yard. And I want the water to reach all the way back in here. So what do I need to do? I can't increase the amount of water that I get in. I don't have this option. So what should I do? I'm holding the hose with my hand right now. What should I be doing now? What should I do to get the water to reach this point? You squeeze the end of the hose, right? So what happens to the diameter exactly? You partially cover the end of the hose. Means doing what? Means reducing the diameter. You reduce the diameter on here. And what happens as a result? When I reduce the diameter, the same water, I didn't increase the amount of water coming in. The same water gonna be traveling at a higher pressure and will reach the second point. This is the same exact concept when you're dealing with your blood pressure. So if I told you that ADH is also called vasopressin, means it's gonna be constricting the blood vessels. It puts a pressure on the blood vessel, constricts the vessel. So what's gonna be its effect on my blood pressure? So you see on here, when you squeeze the end of the hose, what happens to the water pressure? The water travels at a greater pressure, right? Higher pressure. So when you contract the blood vessels, when you constrict the blood vessels, what's going to happen to the blood pressure? The blood also going to have an increase in its pressure, increasing your blood pressure. All right, so it's the same exact concept. When you reduce the diameter, what's going to happen to the pressure? It increases. Questions, questions, questions? All right, so what are the different hormones that we've seen so far? We've seen the hormones released from the pituitary gland. Anterior pituitary gland was releasing the growth hormone, TSH, ACTH, and the gonadotropins, which are FSH, LH, as well as the prolactin. The neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary gland, was releasing two major hormones. One is the oxytocin that enhances the uterine contractions during childbirth and enhances the milk ejection or letdown during lactation. ADH is the hormone that will be retaining the water from being released out in the urine, increasing the blood volume and so pressure. Also, it's going to be constricting the blood vessels, vasoconstriction, going to result also in an increase in the blood pressure. Any questions? Any questions? All right, we can have a break for 10. We come back, discuss more about the endocrine system.